Acoustic Energy, The Origins by Adam Rayner. The most fun part of any superhero story, from Batman to Superman, is always the beginning or origin story. Here's the tale of Jones the Speaker, Acoustic Energy's birth, and the rock and roll industry of the 1980s. 40 years ago, Phil Jones, my old boss from the days of rock and roll, rescued me from a rehearsal studio I was working at and asked me to be his production manager for his new speaker company, Acoustic Energy. I was thrilled and leapt at the chance. What follows is a story of our mutual destiny and the live music scene in the 1980s, culminating in a bizarre slice of the purest serendipity that birthed the very DNA of Acoustic Energy. The startlingly clear, crisp, almost impossibly detailed sound. I didn't even know what power compression was, but its absence in the sound of Acoustic Energy speakers gave me goosebumps. The immediacy, the accuracy, and that whole fabulous soundstage hanging before you, quite dissociated from where you could see the loudspeaker enclosures. And it started with a broken 15-inch speaker and the fact that you cannot ever mix just enough araldite, 2-part epoxy resin glue. Rock and roll and going insane on a desert island. Welsh in roots, Jones is a mad keen musician and has always adored everything about loudspeakers and making music, especially his instrument, the bass guitar. I was a student at the University of East Anglia studying environmental sciences just before it got trendy. It also turned out that UEA was the only real venue in Norfolk for proper gigs for bands. Only 4 universities in the UK were on the same level, and we would get bands for whom the very next date on their tour was the then Hammersmith Odeon. I do detest the whole beer branding and name changing. The Hammersmith venue was always an Odeon cinema first. It was exciting and fun, and we had the who's who of 1980s pop and rock. The Cure, Kajagoogoo, Duran Duran, Talk Talk, and legends like B.B. King and Stevie Nicks. If they were touring the UK, they came to us. The UEA Ents Committee employed a bloke called Nick Rains, who booked the bands and ran the venue, and they were allowed to lose £7,000 a term, which was a lot of money back then, dead lefty. The Go-Go's found out that their ticket was socially priced at 50p for our lower common room venue, and were livid. Their pay was based on door takes, so they were going to get flap all pay. The venue was really small versus the Hammersmith-sized PA speaker rigs they crammed in. Public Image Limited had a stage set made of mock tile-finished hardboard to look like a public loo, complete with some graffiti. I snuck in a marker pen and added to the tiles with a quote from Fungus the Bogeyman. "Putrefaction is the end of all that nature doth intend." As John Lydon was busy shaking off the Johnny Rotten image at the time with his new band, he saw this and got so angry that I ran away and hid for a while. That was after I saw him come on stage, look at the tiny venue and literally shout at the crew, "I want some serious hearing damage in here tonight." It was bloody loud, and I think he got his wish. Ents was such a cool thing to do, yet bloody hard work. You were a venue humper. You went to the LCR early in the day to unload the huge flight cases from the trucks outside and helped with tear-down after the gig. I became adept at microphone cable coiling and was good at humping, as I was covered in hamburger from the mad keen flipper swimming at my scuba diving club. And any bit of water I could get in. I even got called Mr. Muscles by a lass who was backing vocalist for Mari Wilson. She wanted to be lifted off the stage rather than walk around the still setting up monitor desk. Her name was Michelle Collins. She's been on TV a bit since. I was so large-shouldered that rather than pushing boxes to and fro, I would work with the driver of the PA system truck. This meant lots of lifting. After the gig was over and the cable coiling was done, the first things placed into the truck would be the amp racks. This was back when the power amplifiers were not simply built into the speaker enclosures, as they all are nowadays. Small but weighty boxes on wheels had to be lifted into stacks on the dance floor, or that trailer floor area directly above the articulation point, as it was the heaviest gear. This added to the shoulder muscles. After the Tears for Fears gig, where I had got on well with the tour manager, I somehow fixed it to go visit him in London for lunch, weeks later in the term break. I met him in his office in Islington, and I now cannot recall much apart from him being happy to help start off a kid's career. Mr. Tears for Fears gave me the most valuable piece of paper ever. It was a list of truly good public address sound reinforcement companies, from pub to big venue grade, that he rated. As well as mighty greats like Entec, there was also a little one called DB Higher. The loan gave the hint, for it turned out that this man knew his decibels. I made calls, and it transpired that DB Higher was on my side of London and could use some roadieing help. I went to see the owner, Phil Jones, and got the gig. I could borrow my mum's car, park near his flat, and then join him in his Luton boxed transit van as we went off to pubs and clubs around London and Essex. The Bull and Gate, Kentish town, only stopped gigs in 2013, and the Pink Toothbrush in Rayleigh never stopped and is now a legendary venue. Because Phil Jones was mad as a ferret about bass, he had wanted to provide the biggest profundity on the PA market at his level. This was achieved by two colossal enclosures that were folded exponential horns. They each had a Gauss brand 15-inch heavy-duty long excursion woofer in their guts. But what Phil had done was phenomenal. Struggling with the problem for a while, he literally dreamed the physical shape of his sleep, in his sleep. He awoke and exclaimed, "Eureka!" like an old Greek philosopher, for Phil had worked out how to fold the horns so the bass would be huge, but that the boxes could still be fitted two abreast in his Luton box van, allowing for the wheel housings. He just needed a gorilla to move them around. That'd be me. Equally as obsessive about clarity, Phil had also swiped some old dusty horns from under a stage at a cinema, Westrex, or Western Electric multi-cellular horns, made of complex folded steel sheet. Things of great beauty that dispersed the compression driver's sound with width and height. Two JBL bullet tweeters per box helped too. Our PA sound was thus large, clear and deep, and it worked. Sound got around and we were especially loved by reggae acts. These bass horns were huge, and it turned out never destined for commercial success as designed because they used so much woodwork. Later I got work at the biggest company on the sheet that Tears for Fears man had given me, called TFA. The mild-mannered chap who had hired me for warehouse PA building and some UK gigs was Bill Kelsey. He had designed a PA system for the Bob Dylan Carlos Santana 1984 World Tour. I eventually asked Bill about the Jones deep bass bins and if he was impressed by them, and he just dismissed them, explaining that firstly, speaker drivers were cheaper than big woodwork enclosures, so you just use more speakers, and that secondly, the truck space was also the problem. Finally, he also said you don't want much bass below 50 Hz in the PA, as it becomes really hard to control in big venues. I went back to work screwing woofers into enclosures for Bob. After pushing around a lot of boxes for Phil, and especially putting these mid-high units on top of the PA stack by sheer reach and muscle, I could state that if it was £120 weight or less and 8.5 feet up or less, I could lift it up or get it down from there on my own. I would describe myself as a human forklift, and it got me work. Funnily enough, in later years, as a posh hi-fi speaker reviewer, I am certain that I was initially sent the truly big speakers because doing a two-person unpack safely on my own was not an issue. If I wrapped my bare arms around a loudspeaker and leaned my body weight back, it would tend to come with. Up and out of the polyurethane foam packing in the carton, no help needed. Back at the pub gig scene, just for the hell of it, Jones had assembled a beautifully balanced live mix feed sideways through the mixing desk, often a bit different tonally to what the room wanted best in the PA, to allow me to record the gig by stereo line in to my Iowa carry-in compo. It was simply a thing to amuse himself, as Phil was now saving for a house with a recording studio in the garden. He wanted to record, and this was a professional, minor challenge he enjoyed. This compo thing was barely portable, a mighty faux flight case comprising battery pack, cassette deck, radio and pre-power amp, paired with ported speakers, all in the box. It was all separate components, and I made pro-grade RCA cables for it to replace the stock ones it came with. I would let that band recording play on battery power and everything was unplugged as we put everything away. Many times I was able to sell the band the best live recording they would ever get, mixed by an expert, for a £5. That was a side hustle killing when my pay was £15 a night. Phil had gone through hell to get to the position of playing the band, as he was the front-of-house mixer that came with the PA he rented out. He got into trouble when pulled over by the police in the small hours one time. The copper asked him about all the big public address speaker boxes, and were they all his? How had he come by them? Apparently saying, "I got them by being intelligent and hard-working," is not a good way to placate a metropolitan policeman at midnight. Here's how he got them. Before there was GPS, there was the Decca navigator system. It was for planes and shipping, and by the 80s it was affordable enough to be in a scuba dive boat. We were out of sight of land. We'd been sitting around in our rubber suits for an hour, but the little display of 2 rows of red light numbers in the binnacle told our boat captain where we were. "Right, it's down there, off you get," and off we plop. The visibility wasn't too bad, and there, as we descended, was the shallow shipwreck we were diving to see. It was like magic to me. While I was scuba diving, Phil Jones had marooned himself on a desert island on a massive salary as keeper of a Decca navigator transmission station. The cost and need of this system meant he was paid enough to buy a PA when he got off his island. Decca's crucial role meant that expenses cost was no object, but they had silly rules. He could order any and as much food as he wanted, but dogs were not allowed, and he couldn't order pet food. So Phil simply ordered ye olde oak tinned ham by the crate for his scary dog. It was such a lonely and remote job that, driven half bonkers by the solitude, Phil would go out and make more roads on the island, driving the bulldozer that had simply been left behind when the transmitter station had been installed. It was cheaper to buy and abandon a bulldozer than to remove it from the island. So when a young copper asked him, a bit of PTSD kicked in, and Phil gave him the snarky answer. My roadie education began in that Luton Transit van. We had no radio in the van, and the conversation would be about the band, the venue, how good the get-in was, and of course the PA and speaker stuff. Phil would tell me the illustrious industrial history of his stolen multi-cells and how they were impossible to find now as a concept, about their glory days in a cinema and how they had been abandoned. I'm sure he gave them a better home than anyone else ever could have. Acoustic horsepower is a not really scientific term, but if you convert the SI units, one acoustic horsepower is about 746 watts. Phil mentioned that to me one day, finding it amusing. The expression acoustic energy definitely entertained him. And boy, did we ever have some energy. Those bass bins were mostly used as stage extensions. They were so big. We had a few backing vocalists set up atop them, only to squirm back to the stage as they got grunting. The inevitable vibrations up their leg bones were just too much. True to his name, the DB Hire PA company owned a decibel meter that Phil liked to use, and we measured one gig at a ridiculous 126 dB. But the most absurd thing was the deep bass. Queen Elizabeth College was the venue. I recall my trousers literally flapping at the back of the hall with 20 hertz just peaking at the desk. We did the Brixton Cricket Club AGM gig, the Hackney All Nations Club, the Podium in New Covent Garden, and we were hired by Johnny Osborne and the Instigators. It was kind of educational for a middle-class white boy who thought he had it all down. I thought as I was with the sound system I'd be accepted. Most did, few didn't, but our bass was huge, and they loved us for it. The serendipitous moment. And so, patient readers, listeners, we come to an afternoon tea time at Phil's flat. We had a double booking at the Pink Toothbrush, and each band had paid. But we had to do only one load in and one load out to do both gigs. That meant time for a cuppa before we sallied forth. On the floor of the living room was a Gauss loudspeaker transducer, a big sexy pro-grade woofer of great expense, power and durability. As long as nobody drops something on the cone and rips it. Someone had. Phil was hacked off. The drive was very costly. He wanted to fix it. It wasn't worth taking to see Great Uncle Bulgaria at Wembley loudspeakers for a whole recone. So he thought, why not try some araldite? He mixed a little up, and after pushing the honest paper pulp cone ripped back together neatly, he applied it, and it dripped down the cone. Just trying to tidy it up and realising idly that it had way too much glue mix, Phil ended up coating the whole driver with it, saying, well, it'll be like the rubberised coatings you get, but rigid. I wonder how it'll cope with extra weight. And with that, off we went to the gig. And that was that, I thought, until the next day. Phil had a pair of huge tannoy Westminsters and a small set of JBL speakers that were perched atop them in his living room. He could play either pair, switched from his hi-fi, and I was astonished at the experience. I'd never having heard sexy home speakers before. They sounded amazing. The ones my mum had with the Binatone record player were awful. He had this single chassis lumpy hi-fi unit that lay on its back, a Rotel, I think, and the speakers all ran from it. Phil had had it breathed upon, apparently, and had added a bunch more power output transistors to make it fully 1,000 watts. Kilowatt was a favourite term for Phil, and still is for me. That poor torn Gauss was just there on the carpet looking shiny, and the rip didn't show any more. It was fixed. With a fat wire, Phil connected it to the amp. It looked neat, almost as if it was meant to be epoxy-coated. With an odd face-splitting grin of his, Phil fired it up. It's rated at 200 watts. He turned it up and up, never yet more insanely up, until it was taking the full kilowatt of output that this thing could make, from a flaming signal generator sending a nasty, deep, pure sine wave of bass tone into the guts of the Gauss. It was not enclosed, but the loudspeaker didn't care. The whole flat just started to become one with the huge cast chassis and the stout Gauss's woofers moving mass on the floorboards. Couldn't you yourself think? "What is it about that, then?" said Phil loudly as it turned back down. "Are you kidding? Holy heck!" I was glad nobody was in downstairs. And all that meant I was literally there when the lightning spark struck. The big, dark, technical secrets of acoustic energy. It's one thing to be curious and knowledgeable, but it is another to extrapolate and innovate. And Phil Jones is one of the golden geese, those who lay golden eggs of loudspeaker technology and development that give the manufacturer a reputation of excellence. Any truly successful loudspeaker manufacturer absolutely needs one, although merely re-enclosing a famous maker's transducers. That isn't nearly as notable, no matter how clever the acoustics of their speaker box. But what came from that clumsy, absurd experiment with a repaired woofer set Phil thinking. That big old 15-inch Gauss speaker cone with all its extra moving mass of glue, however thinly spread, was really using the elasticity of the suspension, top roll and bottom spider. And the air ducts within the motor assembly were now moving so much air that despite the incredibly stupid amount of power Phil was dumping in it, the driver just played on and on, yet it somehow seemed to keep the perfect tone that Phil was giving the amp from his tone generator. It didn't start making ugly squawking or gurking noises, it just shook the flat to bits until he stopped the watts. That Gauss's suspension was like my old Volvo's. It wasn't until some time later that Phil got in touch to tell me about his new venture and to ask if I fancied a career change from running a rehearsal studio, for he had started working on the new cone concept based on this massive woofer's behaviour and come up with something, a genuine leap forwards in one key area of physics: rigidity. Okay, here's a super quick rundown of the loudspeaker physics conundrum. In order to faithfully reproduce sound from the signal input without distortion or coloration being added, a loudspeaker transducer needs to be of nil cone mass, limitless power handling for headroom, and to be absolutely pistonic throughout its travel. It also needs to be able to ignore the acceleration at the end of each change of direction of travel and just go the other way regardless, despite, say, 10,000 gravities needed to reverse the direction of a tweeter dome at 20 kHz. That is literally not possible. How well a speaker makes sound is often measured in efficiency, or how loud it is at a metre away, with just one exact watt. Expressed in decibels, anything above 90 dB is good. To handle big power, you will lose efficiency. A Lamborghini Countach went fast by pushing a lot of air out of the way with a terrible coefficient of drag. The AE1 had a lowish efficiency, but took 200 watts RMS. What Phil Jones had found out was pure materials science, and he took advantage of it. That crazed rigidity was what he sought, and he found it in anodized aluminium. Here's the sexy bit: alumina, or aluminium oxide, the anodized ceramic layer on the top of anodized aluminium, is a solid 9 on the Mo scale. That puts it up with emeralds, rubies, carborundum, and just one notch below diamond. That anodized layer is hard, and it will not squeeze nor stretch at all. So what if you spun a skinny aluminium speaker cone and had it anodized all over both sides? You'd get a laminate, a posh word for a sandwich, 2 layers of anodized alumina with the original aluminium cone in between, and it became a truly incredible cone material. Trouble was, it was heavy, so the driver got smaller and smaller until the optimum scale for this effect to take place was found at a mere 5 inches. And of course, as the cone was metal, it needed a sexy little pointy cone instead of a dome in the middle of the same material. On a seriously compliant foam surround, the driver was ready to rock. But there was more, and this is why everyone was getting excited. You can call it the tinfoil effect. The truth is, cooks burn themselves. Licking Pixar's Ratatouille, part of the animator's genius, veracity, was to include this in the cartoon subtly with marks on the chef's arms. And we've all done it. But have you also noticed, as soon as you take tin foil off the meat, it cools instantly and cannot hold enough hotness on its own to burn you, unlike the Yorkshire pudding tin. Likewise, at 0.2 millimetres thick, that ridiculously rigid metal cone is one rapid heat dissipator, and the coil wound around the back of this small speaker was a funkin' doozy, just like as if a public address engineer had designed it. Oversized and able to eat 200 watts, you could spank it without cooking it. It stayed cool. All speaker coils are deep in the guts of their magnet. Heat builds up and normally takes its time to dissipate. In the AE1 5-inch, that heat was thermally coupled to the cone and was conducted away in an instant by the metal cone acting like tinfoil. That and the fact that it was on an absurdly long throw suspension made it like a naughty piston wanting to pump your world. The resulting sound definitely gave you goosebumps, although tiny boxes, the AE1 could do stuff that only big, fancy, even more expensive speakers could do, and play without power compression, the one thing that normally makes you realise it's speakers and not life. It's about the large signal spikes, the crucial fat bits, the ting of a drumstick tip on the bell of a cymbal, the things that need a big, fast driver, except for AE1, you didn't. Coupled with a blisteringly fast tweeter, Jones had a winner on his hands. Alvin Gold's review of the AE1, working out with the AE1, was an astonished assessment, with images of small but weighty hand barbells in the article. The guys at Acoustic Energy were over the moon. Jones once referred to Alvin with a term you can't use if you don't want to upset the religious, but he deemed Alvin a deity. I simply remember thinking how one day it'd be lovely to be seen as a speaker expert like Alvin. What an experience it was. I grasped that chance for the new job from my Hessian-lined dungeon rehearsal studio to a new small industrial unit in Ealing. I could commute. I got to specify and order our workstations, and we got the parts coming in. The cones from the motor racing company who had finally learned to use small, tiny clips to hold our delicate cones when anodizing. The hand-assembled passive crossovers built by just one person. They had to be made with special induct coils, ferrite end caps, or they too would warm, fill up, and power compress. This was another mad power inner feature. Along with asymmetric inner walls to the boxes via some floor screed that added epic mass, the AE1 was like a Model T Ford. You could have any colour as long as it was Gratex black. Like a PA box. The speaker grills were held on by plastic inserts. They had a hole or a tiny butt plug in the bit that showed once inserted into the MDF location. These were called Elons. The world's richest man is named after speaker grill holders. The fancy AE1 badges on the front were a violently expensive item, and the serial-numbered rear panel decals were a preciously guarded final component. At the end of each production run, the serial numbers were recorded. Longhand, my Filofax. And of course we needed more models, yet Phil was essentially a PA genius, so the AE2 just had two of these mad drivers with the tweeter between and took more power. The AE4 was a very rare thing, and had four of the small drivers around one of the lovely tweeters, and completely required you to be in a very big room some way back. Like a concert. Thus, what was once a lazily overmixed glue repair became a phenomenon of 80s speaker heritage. It wasn't long before it was worked out how to make a bigger metal cone driver with AE DNA, which became the AE3, and even how to make the boxes pretty enough for better partner acceptability, with wood finishes and all. And now that was all so long ago, and Acoustic Energy is roaring into its fourth decade with time-served golden geese of their own, and a new AE1 40th Anniversary edition. I remain deeply proud to have been a part of this right at the beginning, and I admit I've been bragging about it in print ever since. After all these years, tested every tweeter we were going to use in a testing enclosure of known good bits but no tweeter parts. I had test boxes with no crossover but both drivers. I had one with only the main driver missing. I lined a bit of racking with rubbery sheets to make an inert test space, and would play music through every component HF, LF and crossover before they were built into finished speaker enclosures. One day I found a crossover that sounded a bit dull. I called Phil over from the office and asked him to listen to it. At first he wasn't sure what it meant, and then he could hear it too. Taking a multimeter to each component on the passive crossover, he found a fault. One resistor was off spec by 0.18 of an ohm. He said I had golden ears. It was a good day.